So then I started digging deeper into this character called Saturn by the Romans, called Shemiyaza by the Hebrews, and found that you can identify this character by a number of different names in a number of different cultures in the ancient world. He was the chief god of the Assyrians, called Ashur. He was the creator god of Mesopotamia, called Enlil. He was the creator god of the Canaanites, called El. The Hebrews called him Molech, as well as Shemiyaza. Phoenicians called him Baal Haman. The Amorites and the Philistines called him Dagon. So this entity, in all of these various iterations, was connected to the netherworld one way or the other. Either he was confined there, or he was banished there, or he had just been demoted when the storm god took over as the king of the pantheon. In Babylon and Akkad and Sumer, that was Marduk. In Canaan, that was Baal. In Greece, it was Zeus. In Rome, it was Jupiter. It's the same story over and over.
It's time for the Strange O'Clock podcast, where you get to hear strange news with Christian views. Welcome to the Strange O'Clock podcast with Michael and Jeri. We are so blessed with our honored guest, Derek Gilbert, and he needs no introduction to a lot of people listening, but for those who are unfamiliar with Derek, I'll read an introduction on his website. Derek hosts the daily news analysis program 5 in 10 for Skywatch TV and co-hosts Sci Friday and Unraveling Revelation with his lovely wife, author and analyst Sharon Gilbert. He's been interviewing guests on A View from the Bunker since 2009. Since 2014, the Gilberts have produced a weekly Bible study, the Gilbert House Fellowship, a journey through the Bible verse by verse in chronological order. Derek is a Christian, a husband and father, and the author of the groundbreaking books, Bad Moon Rising, an analysis of the spiritual forces behind Islam, The Great Inception, and Last Clash of the Titans. He and Sharon have authored Giants, Gods, and Dragons, a fresh take on end times prophecy that names the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse and veneration, which exposes the influence of the pagan cult of the dead in ancient Canaan and on Bible prophecy. Derek's latest book is The Second Coming of Saturn, which connects the angelic rebellion briefly mentioned in Genesis 6, the angel of the bottomless pit called Abaddon and Apollyon, and occult symbolism embedded in the art and architecture of the United States Capitol. Derek also teamed with Josh Peck on The Day the Earth Stands Still, which features new research on the occult origins of ancient aliens. Derek is a lifelong fan of the Chicago Cubs, prefers glasses to contacts, and he's been known to sing the high part in barbershop and gospel quartets. Welcome, Derek. We are huge fans. I would say that I would say that Michael and I are your number one fans, but we don't want to obviously outshadow the rest of your fans. So we are among many of your fans. How's that?
You are very gracious. Thank you.
Thank you. So Derek, thank you so much for carving out your precious time for us. So Derek, I have been binge watching and binge listening to your View from the Bunker podcast on Apple Podcasts, as well as watching you on interviews with other podcasters. So I'm so glad to be right up there with the other podcasters. And so Derek, I had downloaded your book, The Second Coming of Saturn, and I read the first 4 chapters. Actually listened to it. So it's nice that Amazon Alexa had actually read it for me, so we could use AI for our advantage, at least for the meantime, right? So Derek, tell us about your latest and greatest book, The Second Coming of Saturn.
Well, one of the characters in the history of this supernatural war who always kind of fascinated me is Shemiyaza. His name is given as the leader of that rebellion that's very briefly described in Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. The sons of God saw that the daughters of man were fair, and they took wives of any they chose, and the giants or the Nephilim were on the earth in those days. And also after that, whenever the sons of God went into the daughters of man, we don't get anything more about that rebellion in the Bible, at least not directly, there's some allusions to it later in Scripture if you know what you're looking for. But the book of First Enoch, which was written in the, different sections were written at different times. The first 36 chapters kind of deals with that rebellion in Genesis chapter 6, written in the 3rd century BC, somewhere between 300 and 200 BC. The leader of this rebellion, the chief of this group of rebellious sons of God, is named Shemiyaza. But he seems to disappear from history. And I was always curious as to what happened to him. And as I started piecing together research from our other books, like Last Clash of the Titans, which deals with the overlap between Greek religion, Greek and Roman religion, we call it mythology, but it was their religion, and the Bible, and began to see that there were some really good clues that leader of that rebellion was probably the god who was worshipped by the Romans as Saturn and by the Greeks as Kronos, the leader of the Titans. Because like the Titans, these rebellious angels from Genesis chapter 6 are confined in Tartarus. We know this from 2 Peter 2, verse 4, where he says that God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them into, now in our English Bibles it says hell, but the word in Greek is Tartarosis, which means Tartarus, not Hades. It's a different place. According to the Greeks, Tartarus was as far below Hades as the earth is below heaven. This was a special place reserved for supernatural threats to the divine order of things. Now, in the Greeks and the Romans, they believed the Titans been overthrown by Zeus, Jupiter, and the Olympians to cast them into Tartarus. That's the fake news version of what really happened, according to Peter. And then Jude, who echoes 2 Peter, these angels who sinned. And when you read 2 Peter and you read the short book of Jude, it's clear that the sin of those angels was a sexual sin. So the evidence fits. So then I started digging deeper into this character called Saturn by the Romans, called Shemiyaza by the Hebrews, and found that you can identify this character by a number of different names in a number of different cultures in the ancient world. He was the chief god of the Assyrians, called Ashur. He was the creator god of Mesopotamia, called Enlil. He was the creator god of the Canaanites, called El. The Hebrews called him Molech, as well as Shemiyaza. Phoenicians called him Baal Haman. The Amorites and the Philistines called him Dagon. So this entity, in all of these various iterations, was connected to the netherworld one way or the other. Either he was confined there, or he was banished there, or he had just been demoted when the storm god took over as the king of the pantheon. In Babylon and Akkad and Sumer, that was Marduk. In Canaan, that was Baal. In Greece, it was Zeus. In Rome, it was Jupiter. It's the same story over and over. The storm god rises, takes over as king of the pantheon, sometimes by violently overthrowing his father, who is then sent down or banished to the netherworld. It's not a coincidence that these stories are the same in the rough outlines over and over and over. The oldest version of the story comes from a group that originated in northern Mesopotamia called the Hurrians. We see them in the Bible as the Horites. Their version of the story, the sky god Anu is overthrown by this entity, Kumarbi, who is Saturn, Kronos, El, Enlil, Molech. And Kumarbi then is overthrown by the storm god Teshub and sent down to the netherworld. The Hurrians, their story begins in the middle of the 5th millennium BC, and we can trace their origin thanks to archaeologists who've identified a very unique and particular style of pottery. And we can trace the movement of these people back about 3,000 years. They were in what later became Israel. We find this pottery in a civilization, or a settlement rather, on the southwest corner of the Sea of Galilee in the early 3rd millennium BC. They got there around 2800 BC, but you can trace them back almost 3,000 years, 2,000 years, to the Ararat Plain in Armenia. In other words, the lowlands below the mountain where Noah's Ark came to rest. And it turns out that these people, the Hurrians, practiced a form of necromancy. In other words, summoning spirits from the dead, summoning the gods from the netherworld, that shows up in the Bible. The way the witch of Endor, or the medium of Endor, summoned the spirit of Samuel, even though she didn't really expect it to be Samuel, she expected her familiar spirit, which is why in the account in 1 Samuel, she cries out with a loud voice when she sees the spirit of Samuel. This is exactly how the ancient Hurrians would summon their chief god, Kumarbi, Saturn, Kronos, El, Enlil, Molech, from the netherworld with a ritual pit that they dug into the earth. Well, traced this through and showed all of the various incarnations of this entity, but also then how there was a poem written about 2,000 years ago. This is something that Tom Horn first brought out in his book, Zenith 20, or let's see, Apollyon Rising 2012, and then Zenith 2016. The Roman poet Virgil in the 1st century BC was a contemporary of Julius Caesar and then Julius's nephew, Caesar Augustus, called the Fourth Eclogue, where he prophesied, well, he predicted, it's been taken as a prophecy by occult adepts and New Agers. He predicted the return of a golden age when Saturn would return to inaugurate the new golden age. It was believed by the Romans that Saturn had ruled over an age where life was wonderful and the earth just produced all. In other words, it was sort of their pagan description of what conditions were like in the Garden of Eden. And because Saturn had been overthrown and we'd gone from the golden age to the silver age to the bronze age to the iron age, interestingly, and this was recorded by a Greek poet named Hesiod in the 7th century BC, it's exactly the same sequence of metals as in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. The head of gold, the torso of silver, the arms of bronze, the legs of iron.
Oh, wow.
Not coincidental. Yeah. And they were looking forward to a return of the golden age when justice returns old Saturn's reign with a new breed of men sent down from heaven.
Wow.
Well, again, occult adepts have been looking for this for 2,000 years. And I argue in the book that you can see aspects of this prophecy. And again, Tom Horn went down this direction with Apollyon Rising 2012 and Zenith 2016. Where I differ from Tom is that he identifies this rising god as Apollo, and I suggest that Apollo and Apollyon are two separate entities, that Apollyon, or Abaddon, is this old god, Saturn, Kronos, El, Enlil, Molech, Shemiyaza, the leader of the rebellion in Genesis 6, is the king of those in the bottomless pit, the angel of the abyss, and he is the one who will lead the things that come out of the abyss in Revelation chapter 9. So this is how it all ties together. This is essentially a biography of Apollyon.
Very interesting. That's so fascinating. Michael, did you have a question or comment?
So much. I mean, you guys, we're going to have to go back and re-listen and take notes. And of course, buy the book. Second coming of the, I almost said second coming of the Antichrist because it's just a little reminder there of our old friend Peter Goodgame, who's still doing good. I just want to say it's so exciting that we have kind of like a peer cross-reference review. Like there's different interpretations of these subjects with you and Tom Horn, and it's really become, and with Michael Heiser's work, like I feel like this is a real like a peer review. It's like a bunch of monks with their scrolls. Not saying you guys are monks, but like that's what this is, preserving culture. Like as we're watching society burn down, and everybody needs to listen to Derek Gilbert, 5 and 10 every day. Really, really good news reports, and just you are so abreast of everything that's happening, and just shutting down all the fake news. It's just, I don't know how you do it. You and Sharon are amazing, but I just want to say that it's like you guys are preserving actual, real research and culture. And as the grandson of Don Basham, deliverance pastor, and my uncle runs Derek Prince Ministries, I have talked to the people that are in charge of that ministry, and they're listening to you guys. So they might not be publishing everything and saying like, I like Michael Heiser, I like Book of Enoch stuff, I like the French Christian movement, I like Derek Gilbert, but they're looking to you guys for leadership. So I've been waiting so long to tell you that. You are literally helping to preserve Christendom.
Well, that is humbling, and I, anything that we get right, Sharon and I always say, we'll give the Lord the credit for that. And when we get it wrong, it's because we get in the way. If God has allowed us to see anything, it's because it's our responsibility then to turn around and share it.
Yes.
So that's all we're trying to do. We're trying to understand the world the way the prophets and the apostles, the early church understood it, especially the prophets and the apostles, and just apply that worldview to Scripture. And there's so much that they knew that are alluded to in Scripture that when we start reading the Bible and applying that worldview, there are things that sort of jump out at us. For example, the Rephaim, which is essentially another title for the Nephilim. They were Nephilim prior to the flood. There are one other reference in Numbers 13:33 about the people in the land of Canaan, and the bad report from the spies coming back and say, they come from the Nephilim. Well, the Rephaim is essentially the title of the spirits of those giants destroyed in the flood in the post-flood world. So when you hear Nephilim and Rephaim, assume that those are the same entities, just whether it's before the flood or after the flood is what we're dealing with. The Rephaim are mentioned in the Bible far more frequently, more often than we realize, because most of the time the word is not translated as a proper name, which it is. We see it as a proper name in the time of Moses, where the Rephaim tribes east of the Jordan River are defeated in battle by the kings who come from the east. Kedorlaomer and his allies in Genesis chapter 14 come from the east, and they fight against the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah and their allies. But on the way, they defeat the Rephaim tribes east of the Jordan River, so that by the time Moses and the Israelites get there, 400 years later, the only one left, the last of the remnant of the Rephaim, is Og, king of Bashan. And isn't it interesting that his kingdom, his domain, was the first military target of the Israelites? And God didn't have the Israelites who'd been camping across the river from Jericho. And that Jordan River is not much of an obstacle, by the way, I got to tell you. At least not today. I mean, here in the United States, at least our part of Missouri, we call it a creek. But instead of crossing over and taking the land of Canaan and then dealing with Og later on, God has them march north to the Golan Heights, defeat Og, and then march back. And that's like just marching that distance with flocks and herds and old people and little kids. Probably that just took 2 months alone, not to mention the time it took to, muster the troops, set the battle, engage the enemy, and so on. So there was something really significant about this last of the remnant of the Rephaim. And then when you look at the account of the conquest of Canaan in the book of Joshua, I believe it's at the end of Joshua chapter 11, it basically was directed at defeating the Anakim. Yes, Joshua 11, beginning at verse 21. And the Anakim, who are counted as Rephaim, according to the book of Deuteronomy, the description of Joshua's war is all about wiping out the Anakim. And that is really interesting. Now we see, and of course, there's a mention here that only in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod did some of the Anakim remain. Now that's significant because then 400 years later, David and his men have to take out the remnants of the giants of the Philistines, who were based in cities like Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod, cities belonging to the five Philistine lords. So this is a really important thing, and yet it's been skipped over by most pastors. For about the last century or so, Bible scholars have conceded, it is now the consensus view among Bible scholars, that the supernatural view of Genesis chapter 6 is the correct one. Yes, this is what Genesis 6 means. Now, a lot of those Bible scholars are secular, and they don't believe that it was really that there really were giants in the land. It's just that that's what the verses mean. But that's not what pastors are being taught. Most pastors come out of seminary being taught that, well, the sons of God in Genesis 6 were the sons of Seth, the third son of Adam and Eve. The righteous sons of Seth married the evil daughters of Cain. And from them came these wicked rulers, and that's who the giants were. They weren't really giants. They were just, important people who ruled unjustly. Well, that really guts a lot of what drives the action in the Bible, because the Bible is all about who is resurrected at the end. I would argue that Isaiah 26 verses 13 through 19 is a prophecy that the faithful will be resurrected. Whereas they, the Rephaim, I mean, that's one of those verses where you don't know it's talking about the Rephaim unless you look at the Hebrew. They are dead, they will not live. They are Rephaim, they will not arise. To that end, you have visited them with destruction and wiped out all remembrance of them. Like, oh, okay. So who are these Rephaim? And that's what's really driven a lot of our research here in the last few years.
That's amazing. Derek, I just wanted to relay some questions that some of your fans and listeners and watchers wanted to relay through me to you, Derek, if you don't mind me asking. So I have about 3 or 4 questions, but I'll just ask one at a time. Then we'll pivot to Michael, then I'll ask another one. So Jennifer Parks, she asked if you have any suggestions for pronouncing the names of the Watchers from First Enoch. She is leading a book club, and it is tricky.
That's a good question. Sharon and I always laugh when we go through our weekly Bible study and we get to those long lists of names. It's like, okay, I hope you get all the names this week, because we probably should do a better job of digging in and studying how to pronounce those names before we get to them. But we don't.
No worries.
But yeah, I would just suggest doing your best with what's there. There are some tools through things like Logos Bible software, some tools online like blueletterbible.com and BibleHub.com, where you can find access to Bible dictionaries that may offer some help there. But again, a lot of those tools ignore First Enoch because it's weird and it's not in the Bible, so why should we pay attention to it?
Right.
Yeah, I disagree, especially lately as I do more study. I think First Enoch is a lot more important. I don't argue that it should be in the Bible. I think it's like, for the same reason we can get spiritual truth from, say, something written by Francis Schaeffer or Charles Spurgeon, but nobody's arguing that there should be a book of Spurgeon in the Bible. Enoch is kind of that same way. There are things in First Enoch that are not in the Old Testament, and yet they're in the New Testament. So why should we then throw out the baby with that bathwater? It's a very interesting document when you start digging into it, and yeah, there are some things in there that are really weird that aren't in the Bible. So, okay, let's ignore those things. But where it touches on things that are in the Bible, and the Bible confirms them through Jesus or the apostles, it's like, okay, well, why do we want to ignore this then? This helps us to understand what was in the minds of the apostles. Jude specifically quotes First Enoch. First Enoch 1 verse 9 is Jude verses 14 and 15. He quotes it. So why do we want to throw out? Yeah. But how do we pronounce all those names? As best as you can.
Right.
Guess.
Absolutely.
Just guess. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Very
Michael?
wise words. I want to ask some questions too. So what is the significance with all the research on Saturn and these various gods and kind of putting them together? The obvious one is Moloch, of course, right now with the abortion issue. But where do we see, for instance, with like the mRNA vaccines and this kind of thing and a possible alien invasion? Do you see any of this connecting in our daily lives today in a way that's relevant to what people are practically going to have to face in these end times, as Johnny McMahon would say?
I think and the reason Josh Peck and I wrote the book, The Day the Earth Stands Still, was just to show that it's really a religion. The idea that we're being contacted by space brothers and they're here to help us evolve and ascend. It's really a new age religion. It's just another deception. And I will say this, because I know that as we're recording this, over the last week and a half or so, it's been big news that a whistleblower, or an alleged whistleblower by the name of David Grush, gave an interview to, so was it Newsnight here just recently? And he's being represented by an attorney named Daniel Sheehan, who himself is a true UFO believer. But when you dig into the story, as an investigative journalist for the New York Post named Stephen Greenstreet has done, you see that the story, which really got hot back in December of 2017 with the release of that Tic Tac video from the 2004 USS Nimitz incident, It's clear that Commander David Fravor, who took that forward-looking infrared radar video of the Tic Tac, David Fravor, the F-18 pilot from the USS Nimitz, clearly he saw what he saw. His co-pilot, his wingman saw what they saw. The radar operators on the Nimitz and the USS Princeton saw what they saw. And they saw a craft that moved at a speed that is way beyond anything that we know about, much faster than the SR-71 Blackbird, which is the fastest airplane on Earth as far as we know. However, we need to think logically here. It doesn't automatically follow that just because they couldn't identify it, that it's extraterrestrial. Right. We also need to understand that Grush, for being a supposed whistleblower, has not seen these craft that have allegedly been recovered by the U.S. military himself. He's just repeating what he was supposedly told by somebody else. It's like, okay, so this is not evidence that can be corroborated. This is hearsay. Sheehan was just interviewed by the Daily Mail in the UK and said that, well, the United States military recovered a craft that had been partially buried in the earth. And even though it's only a 30-foot diameter craft, when the investigators went inside, it was as big as a football stadium.
Oh, my gosh.
So they asked him then, where was this recovered? He couldn't say. When was it recovered? He didn't know. Who saw it? Not sure. And so he didn't have any additional information. Again, it's hearsay. It's hearsay. There is no hard and fast evidence. The other thing that's really interesting to me when we started digging into this, because Josh's and my book came out the week before that story broke in the New York Times. So we hate to sound mercenary. We thought our book would do better because the timing was, awesome. But, people didn't want to hear our version of the story, sadly. But the guy who was leading the charge, Lou Elizondo, who supposedly headed up a program called ATIP, the Advanced Aeronautic Threat Intelligence Program or whatever. It turns out, according to Greenstreet, the investigative journalist for the New York Post, that ATIP never existed.
Oh my gosh.
It never existed. In fact, the Department of Defense put out a denial a couple of years ago, said, no, we didn't have this program, and Lou Elizondo never headed it up. It was pretty much ignored by the mainstream media. God bless him, Tucker Carlson. I agree with him on most things, but even just a week or so ago with his new Tucker on Twitter show, was criticizing the corporate media for not paying more attention to this story. Extraterrestrials are real. This should be the biggest story in the world. Well, God bless you, Tucker, but no, we don't have any hard corroborative evidence. According to Greenstreet, what happened here was this. A research scientist with the Defense Intelligence Agency years ago, back around 2007 or 8, read a book about Skinwalker Ranch. Now, that's that ranch owned by Robert Bigelow, who's a longtime UFO researcher in Utah that's supposed to be the center of all of this high weirdness, skin changers and werewolves and UFOs and all sorts of weird stuff. You can go on YouTube, you can go on cable channels and watch all kinds of programs. We watched the series on Skinwalker Ranch, and it was always like, okay, where's the big wow here? I mean, it's always like, okay, hang on through the commercial break and we'll show you more. And then it's like, where's the reveal here? Well, anyway, this scientist went to Bigelow and asked if he could visit there, and he claimed that he saw some stuff, and so he wrote a book about it. No evidence. And then he went to Senator Harry Reid, the retired senator, the former majority leader from Nevada, who happens to be a good friend of Robert Bigelow. Bigelow, who's very wealthy and was a big supporter of Harry Reid's reelection campaigns. And so they managed to get an allotment of like $22 million in the Department of Defense for something called AWSAP, AAWSAP, which, and I'm going to forget what the acronym stands for, is Advanced Aerospace Weapons something program. Okay. And this program was supposed to be run by the Pentagon to investigate anomalous things in the sky over the U.S., which, as an American, I'm all for that. I mean, we don't want the Chinese and the Russians flying stuff over our skies that we don't know about. Like, big balloons that just float across the country. I mean, that's so hard to shoot down. Well,
exactly.
it turned out that this money was not going towards that kind of research. The Department of Defense didn't know about it. It was going into researching stuff at Skinwalker Ranch. They were taking money that was supposed to look for aerospace weapons, and they were using it to research werewolves and ghosts and stuff.
Oh, wow.
And when the reports started coming out and read by people back in the Pentagon, the guys in the Pentagon are like, why are we spending $22 million on this? Why are we spending this money on this? And why is it going, essentially, the people who were conducting the research were employed by Robert Bigelow, Harry Reid's friend. So
wow.
The Department of Defense said, this is stupid. We're going to close this down. This is not only stupid, it's embarrassing. Harry Reid sent a letter to the Department of Defense trying to save the program. But because the title of the program, this OSAP, had become sort of toxic inside the Pentagon, oh yeah, the ghost hunters. He gave it a new name, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, ATIP. That's where ATIP, the name, came from. Harry Reid made it up trying to save OSAP, which the Pentagon still killed. They just killed the program outright. So that was in 2012. Advance now to 2017. Okay. A journalist named Leslie Keene, who's a true believer in UFOs, she and her partner Ralph Blumenthal pitched an article to the New York Times about this secret government program, this secret Pentagon program to investigate UFOs. And New York Times bought it. Okay. And that's when the Tic Tac video was released.
Wow.
Except that people who are in the UFO community knew that that video has been out on YouTube since 2007. So why is it 10 years later, suddenly now it's a big deal?
Right.
Because Lou Elizondo comes from the Defense Intelligence Agency. Wow. He retires from the DIA in October of 2017. In December of 2017, he shows up as the star of this revelation, the secret Pentagon program that never existed, that he headed up, which he never did, pitching the idea that we're being visited by extraterrestrials.
Wow.
And New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, USA Today, MSNBC, Fox News, Tucker Carlson, all over the story, except it kind of loses steam in the last, the last 5 years. And now this is a reboot. This story is being rebooted with this new guy, David Grush, out there heading it up. Frankly, again, there's no evidence for it. Josh and I made clear in the book that as Christians, we are totally on board with the idea that humans have been visited by inhuman entities for thousands of years. Yes. But there's no evidence, none, that these are extraterrestrial. They are not crossing the gulf of space between here and Zeta Reticuli. They've been here the whole time. And that's the point of the book. That's the point of the whole UFO phenomenon. Now, why are they pointing us in this other direction? I'm not sure. It may be they're trying to hide something that the United States military has that we don't want Russia and China to know about. I mean, why was Roswell spun as an alien craft? Might have something to do with the fact that they didn't want American taxpayers to know that we were paying German scientists who've been scuttled out of Germany after World War II on the rat lines. We're paying Nazi scientists now, 2 years after.
Oh, boy.
Yeah. That wouldn't have flown very well. Better to have America believe that it was aliens. And that story, by the way, really died until like the mid 80s when that book by Moore and Berlitz on the Roswell incident was published. And that only followed the closure of Walker Air Force Base in Roswell. I mean, Walker Air Force Base was a major employer in Roswell, and the economy in Roswell took a major hit when they closed the air base. And suddenly, so the local Chamber of Commerce trying to find something to bring business to the community, say, hey, remember that thing back in 47? You think maybe we could turn that into a festival? And suddenly then everybody's paying attention to Roswell and going there every year to try to find meaning in their lives. Answers to the three big questions. Where'd we come from? Why are we here? And what happens when we die? Well, as Christians, we got the answers in the Bible, but there are people who are more willing to listen to the Ashtar Command or the Galactic Brotherhood or something. So it may be a spiritual deception. It may be a military deception. It may be some combination of both. But I think the UFO phenomenon is it is a disinformation op, whether from the intelligence community or from the principalities and powers, maybe some combination of both.
Fascinating.
Okay.
Very interesting. Here's another question from the same person, Jen Parks. What are your thoughts on Gilgamesh?
Gilgamesh was probably the grandson of the character that we think of as Nimrod. I think Nimrod was the Sumerian king named Enmerkar, who is listed on the Sumerian king list. Gilgamesh was 2 generations after him, whether he was literally his grandson or just 2 kings later. He is an epic hero in Sumerian poetry. I do not think that Gilgamesh was the son of Nimrod and Semiramis. Semiramis was a real person. She was an Assyrian queen named Shamu Ramat. The problem with putting Nimrod and Semiramis together, that really comes from the book by Alexander Hislop around 1860 called The Two Babylons. Nimrod probably lived during the period of history called the Uruk period, which archaeologists put at roughly 3900 BC to about 3100 BC. That is a period in Mesopotamia when Uruk, which was a city-state near the Persian Gulf, southeast Iraq today, but it dominated everything from the Persian Gulf to the Taurus Mountains of Turkey. It was immensely powerful at a period of time when weapons were made of, copper in the early part of that history. They developed bronze at some point in the middle of the 4th millennium BC, but it ended suddenly around 3100 BC. And interestingly, archaeologists digging at a site near Uruk in southeastern Iraq called Eridu, E-R-I-D-U, found the oldest ziggurat, that's a step pyramid, the Mesopotamian step pyramid, the oldest ziggurat in Mesopotamia. And it would have been the biggest if it had ever been finished. According to a Sumerian poem that's been found, Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta, this king Enmerkar, Nimrod, was trying to build up this temple at Eridu, which was called the E-Abzu, means house of the abyss. It was the home, believed to be the home of the god Enki, and it was from the Abzu, the abyss below this temple, that it was believed Enki sent forth the Apkallu, which a scholar named Amar Anus showed about 15 years ago, were the Watchers. I mean, the Mesopotamian conception of the Watchers were the Apkallu. It's just they had a better opinion of the Apkallu than the Hebrews did of the sinful Watchers who descended to Mount Hermon. Well, according to this poem, which even mentions the confusion of language, as in the Tower of Babel story in the book of Genesis, this king was pressuring a neighboring kingdom to give him the building materials he needed to build up this temple into a gleaming mountain and abode of the gods. But according to the poem, something happened, language was changed, and Sumer, which formerly had spoken with one language, now had many different tongues. Well, we know from, and according to the archaeologists who were digging at this location back in 1949, the top level of this temple, which would have been the biggest ziggurat in all of Mesopotamia, bigger than the great ziggurat of Ur that Saddam Hussein rebuilt back in the 1980s, it was never finished. According to them, it was just abandoned for some unknown reason and very, very quickly covered over with sand, right at the end of the Uruk period of history. In other words, the collapse of that civilization coincided with the unfinished Tower of Babel.
Wow.
And of course, we know from Genesis that they left off building the city after God confused the language of the people. So I think that was Nimrod. Gilgamesh, probably a couple of generations later. And my point, getting back to Shamu Ramat, Semiramis, is that she lived in the 9th century BC. The end of the Uruk period was 3100 BC. So you've got a gap there of more than 2,000 years between the two. So that's why I don't put any stock in the Nimrod, Semiramis, Tammuz theory. That was all bad scholarship by Alexander Hislop 160 years ago. But I do think Gilgamesh was a historic person who ruled that kingdom at some point, probably around 3000 BC. He was not, his remains were not found. Nimrod's remains were not found. I know there have been stories out there. In fact, I even spread some of that, 20 years ago when we saw the story after the invasion of Iraq back in 2003. A German archaeology team had been doing some magnetometry at Uruk to try to determine where the city walls had been. This was back in March of 2003. And they found a building, the outlines of a building, and what had been the bed of the Euphrates River. And they said, this appears to be similar to the way the tomb of Gilgamesh is described in the Epic of Gilgamesh. But of course, they had to stop working there because, we invaded in March of 2003. And so the archaeologists had to get out of the way. But they didn't excavate anything. And even if they had, writing hadn't been invented yet, so they wouldn't have had any way of identifying the body. So the stories that have been propagating for the last 20 years that they found Nimrod and they extracted DNA. DNA is a molecule that is much too fragile to survive in the hot and wet conditions around ancient Uruk, because it's in the marshy area of Iraq. It wouldn't have survived. They couldn't have identified it, and the Germans didn't excavate the city anyway. So, yeah,
wow,
it would make a great story, a great basis for a novel. Which I actually started that as sort of a premise, and then I realized I need to do more research. And then as I dug into it, it's like, oh, rats.
I love how you and Gadawa and you guys are like in writing fiction. You're actually doing the research. You're finding out like, oh, this is kind of a bunch of bunk. Like, let's not go there. Let's not promote this. We need you so much out there, Derek, because there's so many just new, weird, Skinwalker Ranch with the UFO Bigfoot dragon thing, and that's exciting for people. And with deep fake, it's easy to just make all kinds of fake videos. I don't even know how L.A. Marzulli does it anymore because like so many deep fake videos of UFOs out there. I can't even find any good UFO videos that are trustworthy anymore. So, but
I have all the respect in the world for L.A. I have all the respect in the world for L.A. for putting his personal resources and his reputation on the line for going out and looking for the physical evidence of these things. So yeah, L.A. Marzulli is a pioneer, and we have all the respect in the world for L.A.
Well, thank you for being a team player in this community of fringianity that's been inspiring I was a missionary in Taiwan for 20 years and China, Japan, and it was your voice and the people that the love of the brethren that between you and everybody else and just everybody, Peter Goodgame, et cetera, David Flint, that I felt like I had become a part of some new movement or church of brotherhood that was fearless. And you had Michael Heiser there, and you had all these guys, and it was just, and you guys are carrying on that torch. And I just want to ask you, where do we go? Like, how do you see us moving forward? Is it like the goal that we just do conferences and write books? Is that where we should be focused? Or like for people that are listening, as we go into this new era with AI and everything that's coming out, what do you see as far as this end time, this church, this, I don't know. It's kind of like it's almost like an underground. I don't know. We need a view from the bunker, sir. What is your view from the bunker moving forward?
One of the things that Mike Heiser did before he passed was he was working on setting up a way to connect people through his nonprofit called Miqlat, Miqlat, Miqlat.org. They have a tool there where you can find people who are part of this. I guess you'd call it fringianity. I mean, Mike was a very careful scholar, but the thing that's really amazing about the body of work that Mike created was that he is the one who he really changed the course of my life, Sharon's life, with the unseen realm. I mean, he shared early drafts of that when it was still under the working title, The Myth That Is True. And as we interviewed Mike and we began to understand the divine council worldview, the idea that there are other supernatural entities who are playing an active role in this long supernatural war, that suddenly the Bible began to make sense. So things in the Bible that were hard to understand before, why was God condemning these Amorites to destruction. I mean, devoted to destruction. We see that phrase over and over in the book of Joshua. It's because they were completely sold out to these spirit beings who rebelled against God and who had them doing these really abominable things. I mean, there are sections of the book of Leviticus you don't read out loud, to children below a certain age because they're kind of graphic. But it's because the Canaanites, the Amorites, were doing these things. So that when Moses came down from the mountain in 1446 BC or whenever that was, the idea that you should only be intimate with your spouse, who it should go without saying is a person of the opposite sex, and that was progressive. And the more we dug into the worship of these pagan gods around ancient Israel, and especially entities like Inanna or Ishtar, Astarte in the Bible, we see that that was this kind of deviant sexuality was part and parcel of her worship. And there were other entities in Anatolia, Greece, and Rome who did the same thing. I mean, the priests of Inanna or say Cybele, the great mother goddess of Anatolia, which is modern day Turkey, would have to castrate themselves in order to serve her in their temples. It was,
oh my gosh,
this was something that God was like reacting to and saying, these are the things that they're doing, and this is why I am casting them out of the land before you. But sadly, as we see in the Bible, the Israelites were getting drawn into this kind of worship. I mean, the reason God sent a plague that killed 24,000 Israelites when they were camping on the plains of Moab directly across from Jericho, you'd think from reading Numbers chapter 21, where which is the account where Phinehas gets a spear and stabs a young Israelite man who is apparently engaged in a fertility rite with a young Midianite princess in the sight of Moses and all Israel. You'd think, well, that's shocking. This is awful. Why? How? No wonder God was so upset. But then when you read Psalm 106, verse 28, what you find that what really angered God was that, the psalmist doesn't even mention the young man and young woman. According to the psalmist, what made God angry was that they began to eat sacrifices offered to the dead. This cult of the dead, this worship of the Rephaim, the Nephilim spirits. And this is a recurring theme through the Old Testament. And it's because of Mike and our understanding that, hey, wait a minute. The Hebrew prophets, as Mike used to say, guess what? Here's a newsflash. The prophets and the apostles read books. They knew what their neighbors believed. And a lot of what's in the Bible is polemic against that. And we've sort of been raised up in the Western church to believe that these gods, small g gods of the Amorites and the Canaanites and the Moabites, and were just their imaginary friends. Well, that's not what God. That's not what God says in the Bible. God calls them gods. Right. God calls them giants. God calls them dragons, which is why we wrote the book, Giants, Gods, and Dragons. These things are real, and when we begin to understand that, suddenly the Bible comes alive. We see, wow, this is like Lord of the Rings on steroids.
That's right.
So, we don't need to be spectacular. We don't need to make up stuff about, the Nephilim are coming back and they're gonna, these giants are gonna, come kill us all. Look, according to the book of Enoch, which was held in very high regard by the apostles in the early church, the spirits of those giants destroyed in the flood of Noah became demons. In fact,
that's right.
The Greeks understood that was the origin of daemons, that the men of the golden age, when Kronos ruled in heaven. In Greek, that phrase, the men of the golden age, meropes anthropoi, that scholar I mentioned earlier, Amar Anus, showed that word merope, anthropoi, that's, meaning humans, anthropology, that's where you get the word. But meropes comes from the same Semitic root behind the word Rephaim. In other words, the demigods of the Greeks, like Heracles and Perseus, were Nephilim. They were Rephaim. The Greeks got the word from the Canaanites. The worship of their demigods was based on the Canaanite worship of the Rephaim. We can trace all of this back to Mount Hermon. In fact, the reason that Roman Catholics and Orthodox Christians venerate saints to this day, according to scholars, this is not Derek Gilbert making this up, is because in the 5th century, Augustine realized that Christians would not stop the practice of offering little offerings, holding ritual meals for what they believed were the spirits of their ancestors. So rather than, since we couldn't get them to stop, Augustine figured, let's have them redirect it to the martyrs and the faithful from years gone by. Yes, the spirits of the saints can intercede for us in the world today. So the practice of praying to the saints derives from a Christianized version of the worship of the Rephaim by the Amorites. It goes all the way back to Mount Hermon, more than, well, I don't know, millennia ago, before the flood.
Wow, fascinating. That's a really deep rabbit hole to go through. And that kind of reminds me of Catholicism. And I'm not trying to down people of Catholic faith, but they do ask the saints to pray with them. And they say that it's okay because they ask, like our living brothers and sisters to pray with them. So they think it's okay to pray, to ask the saints that have passed on to pray with them, which it's, whether or not that's heresy, I just want to leave that up in the air, but that it's interesting how that has roots back into paganism and how there's a syncretism between paganism and Christianity there. So here is one more question. I'm sorry, actually, we're almost done here. And so Carol Watts asked, what's your story? Did you plan on going into the unseen realm when you first started out?
No, I thought I was going to be a radio announcer for my entire life. And I find out now, looking back, that that was just training for what we're doing now.
Wow.
I was in radio broadcasting from the time I got into college. I started on the campus radio station at Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois, WVKC, the voice of Knox College. And after my first show, which was, I think, a classical music show, if I remember right, I got a phone call from the local radio station. The program director says, "Hey, you sound like you can talk. How'd you like a part-time job?" Like, oh, well, cool. Because that sounds like a lot more fun than, studying, then going to law school. Because I was on the debate team in high school, and I really, really enjoy a good argument. I'm like the guy in that Monty Python sketch who'll pay a $5 to have a good argument. So that started the radio career. So I worked my way through college in radio, and went into that full time. I was in radio full time from 1983 until about 92, and then realized it was a lousy way to try to raise a family. By that time I was married, had a daughter. And so I got into, one thing and then another, managed a tuxedo shop for a while, sold real estate for a while, then got into sales. Cause my only usable skills are being able to use a computer and talk. So, but God was
I understand that.
working all of this together and training. So the broadcast background, even though it was secular radio, and I went back into radio when I had my midlife crisis in 2006, got back into talk radio and hosted a talk show in Columbia, Missouri for about a year and a half. But no, I didn't expect this. My first marriage ended in 97. Sharon and I met shortly thereafter. We married in 98. So we've been married 25 years now. We actually—
Congratulations.
Well, thank you. We met on the internet, which is, at a time when only 20% of America was even online, which is interesting.
That's awesome. My husband and I met on the internet too.
It can work. It can work. I wouldn't recommend it for everybody, but it worked for us. And you could just imagine the scene in the Divine Council when you got this woman who was a professional vocalist who went back to school and got a degree in molecular biology, with a degree in it, with an emphasis on genetics, and writes this beautiful fiction, beautiful prose. And then this other guy, this guy who's like an old radio disc jockey, and brings us together. And it's like, really, Lord? I mean, how is this going to work? Just watch.
That's awesome.
And we had started writing, and Sharon will tell you, when we first met, I was I had accepted Christ when I was in the 6th grade, but wasn't mentored, wasn't discipled really. So I really didn't know what that meant. In college, I really fell backwards a long way. And when we met, I was kind of struggling with, what do I believe? Because our daughter was 6 at the time, and I had primary physical custody. And I couldn't, I realized one night, and maybe this was the Holy Spirit kind of hit me on the head with a board, I couldn't explain to our daughter what was right and what was wrong because I didn't have a foundation for my worldview. And so I thought, okay, well, the Bible is a good moral code, but what if it's made up like all of these, shows on the History Channel say? So I started reading apologetics, and that started me down this path. But even when Sharon and I met, I was still arguing that there was no contradiction between the book of Genesis and Darwinian evolution. So I've come a ways. Thankfully, God is patient, and so is my wife. So that started us down this path. But we started writing a fiction series around 2002, where we were writing independently of each other, but we were sharing characters and plot points. And we had a publisher, Christian publisher, that put out her first 2 novels, Winds of Evil and The Armageddon Strain. And while they were working on my novel, The God Conspiracy, they got cold feet. You guys you've got like UFOs and crop circles in here. We're like, yeah, and? Well, I think the thing that really spooked him was that in my novel, The God Conspiracy, which we finally released 2 years ago when it became a lot more relevant, because it deals with a mysterious injection and nobody knows really what's in it. Yeah, this was I started writing it back in 2003, but borrowed from Sharon's novel, The Armageddon Strain, which was really, she's the one who came up with the concept, and she let me borrow characters and the concepts for my novels. Anyway, I think the fact that I was talking about government conspiracies like FEMA camps and spying on citizens during the George W. Bush presidency, that wasn't as popular with Christian readers as it was during the Clinton years or the Obama years. So they said, well, we'll have to part company. So we got the rights back. We're going to start working on some of that again, where we're sharing characters, sharing plot points and whatnot. But no, at the start of all of this, we were actually looking for a way to market our novels. And so our publisher said, why don't you do a TV show? Well, in 2003, 2004, again, you didn't have the tools for recording and producing video that you got today, but they had just come out with in early 2005, they just come out with the code for podcasting. So we did a program on here's why you should buy our books. And then after that, it's like, okay, what do we do next week? Well, the following week was, okay, let's talk about why we write what we write. That became PID Radio, which we're still producing. So, it was intended to, we thought we were podcasting to sell our writing, but it turned out we began podcasting to do what we are doing now, the research, the writing, and the networking with other researchers like Mike Heiser, Tom Horn, L.A. Marzulli, Steve Quayle, and so on and so on.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Derek. Michael, did you have a question?
So many. I don't know how much time we have, but I just wanted to, again, thank you for just your hard work for the Kingdom Realms. And you don't really know me probably very well, but I just have been kind of looking for community after my missionary work kind of fell apart. And I feel like for many of us, your voice and your work and research has brought people a sense of stability, of like, even if you weren't sure about your faith in those years with your daughter and all that, like it's obvious to me that the Lord has used you and Sharon, and just being a team player, like really bringing the rest of the body a sense. I'm talking about, like, I come from Derek Prince Ministries background and Don Basham Deliverance, all this, I was born into it. And that's even shaky at times. And you guys, like your torch that you've been carrying, and now how do we pass that on is my main question and focus right now. My desire is to win disciples, train the next generation, and just promote you guys everywhere. And the Fringe Radio Network has been a great platform for that. I thank you for also promoting us on View from the Bunker. That's very, very sweet and kind of you. And just I invite people to listen to when it's you, Judd Burton, and Brian Godawa. It's just like I feel like I'm listening to a brainstorm of just epic, just Herculean proportions. Sorry to use the pig. It's just so inspiring, and I might be like loading a FedEx truck or working at a late night gig somewhere, and it's just I feel like I'm right there with you guys. Like, you guys really make the word come alive. It's not just religious. It's like, this is important. This is real. And by the way, let me say this too. Your the way that you dress in real life, if anybody's actually met Derek Gilbert in real life, I was stunned by your, like, you really are a professional dresser, sir. And
yes.
I just wanted to say that. And also I want to say that you really touched me. I saw you worshiping God. I want to tell everybody, I saw Derek worshiping God and clearly emotional at the Warriors Conference in San Diego. And I just felt my heart just leapt at just the sight of you and Sharon there engaging in prayer and worship, and the love that I felt. And also the sermon that you preached, sir, at that conference in 2022 was absolutely powerful. Like, you were just laying it out, the enemy striking down the darkness. 2021, I believe. Sorry. And really, like, I just felt just such an honor to be able to have been a part of this journey with you, sir. So sorry, that was a lot. I just, I don't know how much time you have.
You're very gracious. And again, we'll give God credit for all of that, because it's when I get out of the way that things seem to fit together and come together. But, like I said, looking back on my life, I can see why all of these various interests have come together. I mean, whenever I find something really interesting, I tend to do it too much, which is why I've had to step back from singing barbershop quartet for the last 7 years, 8 years, because, as much as I love singing with my brothers in harmony back in Illinois, it just took up a lot of time. It is something I'll come back to. Maybe someday, maybe Sharon and I will sing together at some point. But
that would be wonderful.
We set that aside. And she says that her voice now, and her voice is absolutely glorious. But she considers the written word her voice now. But when I get really interested in something, I tend to do it, 100%. Awesome. I was that way in high school with the debate team, and that really drilled me in how to lay out an argument. I love me a good outliner app, and I use it a lot because, here's bullet point 1, 2, 3, sub point 1, sub point 2, it's like preparing a case for the debate team, and I didn't realize this until recently. I guess this is why I was doing that so much back in high school. The radio career, how to say something quickly, although I rarely do. Conference organizers know, we got to give Derek 90 minutes because he can't say anything in less than 90 minutes. But hopefully, it's like my dad used to say, if you ask Derek the time, he tells you how to build a watch. But hopefully, that 90 minutes is packed with information and it's not fluff.
Oh, yeah.
And that is our goal. And Sharon is the same way. I mean, she's got a very analytical mind when it comes to teaching. She is more of a lateral thinker. I tend to be more of a linear thinker. But when you combine her interests and gifts and mine, the Lord knew what he was doing. And we just want to share the joy that we're finding, thanks to the giants of the faith, like Mike Heiser, like Chuck Missler, and all of those men and women who have devoted their lives to study both digging artifacts out of the sand, translating texts, studying scripture, so that we can step back and try to fit these pieces together and show Christians that God has not asked us to follow him blindly. Ours is not a blind faith. Indeed, the rocks are almost literally right now crying out with evidence that shows what is at stake how the ancients served their gods, how the prophets and the apostles taught the Israelites, the Jews, and then the early church to turn away from that pagan worship. And today, what we're seeing in the world around us as we move into a post-Christian world is a reversion, a regression. It's not progressive, it is regressive as we regress into the old bloody world of pagan religion. And we just want Christians to be encouraged. Look, we may be the remnant, like the remnant of the men of the West outside the gates of Mordor, surrounded by hordes of screaming orcs. But a day is coming when the Messiah returns at the head of that heavenly host. So our mission until then is to stand our ground, like in Ephesians 6, where Paul says we are to stand.
Yes, amen.
Pull the wounded off the battlefield behind our lines, minister to them, explain to the wounded, many of whom who don't even know why they're hurt because they're on the battlefield, ignorant of the fact that there's a war going on.
Exactly.
Explain what is going on.
Yes.
And show how what we see in the world today is consistent with the Christian worldview. Yes, bad things happen to good people. Why? Free will. God created us all as agents with independent thought and capable of independent action. He does not create us as little wind-up automatons incapable of doing anything except loving and praising him. The same holds true in the spirit realm. So the principalities and powers, the fallen angels, the demons, they also had free will, have free will, and chose, many of them, chose badly. That's why the world's in the state that it's in. And we can show that through what we find in Scripture, and now through what we find in archaeology. It is just incredible. So we're just blessed to do what we do. And any opportunity I have to share that hope, like on your program tonight, which, by the way, Strange O'Clock is such a brilliant title. I wish I'd thought of it. This is really an honor. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. We are honored, blessed, and impressed by your research and your books and your podcasts and everything about you and Sharon. We're just blown away in such a positive way. And it's amazing how the Lord brought you two together to be a power couple, a Holy Spirit power couple. We're just speechless. We're just really, really glad that you and other greats like Dr. Mike Heiser, God rest his soul, when we see him with the Lord, in heaven, we're going to be so grateful for him leading the way, and L.A. Marzulli and you and the other people that you mentioned. So you're right up there with them. So we're very grateful for you and other people such as yourself. So we're very thankful.
You're very kind. But like I said, I think they're on a whole nother level. We're just blessed that we can hold up our little Bic lighter, compared to the torches that they carry.
Oh, you're very humble and kind. You're very, very sweet. Thank you so much for carving out time for our Strange O'Clock podcast. And folks who are listening, some people wonder, why did we call ourselves Strange O'Clock podcast? And it was so funny. I was driving along one day and I was kind of frustrated that maybe I wasn't getting the listeners, the listenership that I wanted to in terms of people listening or watching on YouTube or my podcast or whatever, because it was just me, myself, and I, which is kind of lonely. And I did team up with some other people in the past, such as Paratooth Radio, and then Kay Carswell with Deception and Detection Radio. And actually, I got her into podcasting, and then we split off and did our different things. And then it was just me for many, many years. And I was like, Lord, what name should I change, Thai Girl for God Radio to, and or Amazing Grace Radio to it rather. And I was driving along, and this all of a sudden it just popped into my head, Strange O'Clock podcast. And I go, what? That's weird. That's strange. And I did some research, and I saw, if you don't mind me sharing a little bit of the story with you. So I did some research, and I thought, oh my gosh, does somebody else have that same name? And there was no other podcast name, but there is a French alternative rock band called Strange O'Clock. And it's so funny because they probably
naturally
think, oh mon bleu, well, they have copied our name, how dare them, or whatever, but it's so funny. There's no relationship whatsoever. It just just came out of nowhere. I mean, it came from the Lord, I believe. And then I was like, gosh, it's so lonely podcasting by myself, And then I thought, well, who should be my co-host? And then Michael Basham popped in my head, and yeah, he spent 20 years in Asia, and he's more Asian than me on the inside, that is. And I only spent like cumulatively only 6 months in Asia, and I'm Asian, but he's more Asian on the inside, I'm more Asian on the outside, so it kind of fits. But anyway, so that's a little bit of our story. And anyway, so thank you so much, Derek. I do actually have to just ask one more last question from a listener. You kind of touched on it, but where and how did you meet Sharon? And I know you kind of said that you met each other on the internet. Can you amplify that a little bit?
Sure. She had been previously married, and my marriage had broken up. Divorce papers had been filed, and so I was thinking, well, I don't want to spend the rest of my life alone, but
Right.
I've got a 6-year-old little girl here at home. I can't really see justifying hiring a babysitter so I could go out, on dates. And I tried the bar scene when I was, in radio back in my 20s, and I'm not going to find anybody I want to spend my life with that way. Hey, I wonder if there are personal ads. Well, the St. Louis alternative newspaper, the Riverfront Times, I knew there were personal ads in there, but some of those you can't read with children in the room either. So
oh my goodness.
I wonder if there's anything online. And so I went online and I found Match.com. Now, again, this is back in 1997 when only 20% of America was even online. So, you go through and here's the thing. This is interesting too. They have a little survey, or at least they did then, where you list your likes and dislikes and, what color hair, where smoker, non-smoker, religious preference, how far are you willing to go to meet somebody? And I thought about this. Now, I was in St. Louis at the time, and you had to check a box, 5 miles, 10 miles, 50 miles. And I thought, okay, 200 miles, that's reasonable. That's like 3 hours, 3.5 hours. I can do that. So 200 miles. So I clicked that. And then that very first night, this profile pops up, this very striking looking woman. And I started reading her profile, and I was like, oh, she's a singer. Well, I like to sing. This was when I was really deep into the barbershop quartet stuff back in the 90s. And love that. And she's a writer. Oh, and she's a scientist too. Oh, wow, this is really fast. Oh, and she likes the Three Stooges. Yes. So
that's awesome.
So I sent her a note, and yeah. So I was more of a Shemp fan than a Curly fan, but that's all right. So we exchanged some emails. We started talking back and forth, and she was in Bloomington, Indiana. She was working at the School of Optometry at Indiana University. So
oh wow,
we began talking. Okay. She and I began talking on the phone in August. I think the first email was late July of 97. Started talking on the phone, and this was when you still had to pay long distance charges. So we ran up some phone bills. We met in September. She drove from Bloomington to St. Louis, and God bless her for having the guts, because here she is, a single woman driving to meet and spend the weekend in the home of a guy she'd never met face to face before. Woo. But
Bravo.
she figured, okay, he's got a 6-year-old daughter in the house, so and our very first night out, we went to Olive Garden with our daughter, who is now 32. And
wow.
Nicole impressed by taking black olives and putting black olives on all the ends of her fingertips.
Aww.
And, so that was endearing, I suppose. But we found later, and we got married in January, by the way. So we met for the first time face to face in September, and October, November, December, January. 4 months later, we were married, and we celebrated 25 years in January. But when
awesome.
It occurred to me one day after we had been married for a while. Gee, I wonder how far Bloomington, Indiana was or is from where I was living at the time in Manchester, Missouri. And so I looked it up on Google Maps, 195 miles. So if I had not checked the 200-mile box, if I had checked 150,
wow,
we would not have met. So
details.
yeah, there was, again, the hand of the Lord kind of in this guiding things.
Totally.
And it, again, friends of mine thought I was crazy. You met her how? And she lives where? I mean, Derek, 2.5 million people in the St. Louis metro area. You couldn't find a girl, a woman in the St. Louis metro. It's like, no, you guys don't understand. This is, So anyway,
Definitely.
the Lord knew what he was doing. So that's how we met. Because I checked the 200-mile box on Match.com.
I love that story. I love a good godly love story and how the Lord is the best matchmaker whatsoever. I mean,
yeah.
Similarly, I met my husband online, and it was actually through an old website called oneandonly.com, ONEANDONLY.com. And this was I had been online dating since 98. So I was online dating 98, 99. 2000, and then so in 2001, early 2001, I'm sorry, pardon me. Okay, go back to like the fall of 2000, and I filled out an online profile, and I did something similar, obviously, you filled out religion, height, weight, racial preferences, but most of all, I wanted him to be a Christian and love the Lord. And I also had to check off a box of how far I would be willing to meet this person, and I think I might have chosen 50 miles. And my husband, obviously fell within that 50-mile parameter, but it was one of those, it was not as highfalutin as Match.com. It was definitely kind of one of those basic websites. But nonetheless, the Lord used that to help me meet my hubby. And it was funny because the picture that he uploaded was very fuzzy, very, very blurry and fuzzy. And but he said that he went to one of the largest churches in Sacramento. And for some reason, it really piqued my interest because I thought, I know that church is Capital Christian Center, which was a huge church in Sacramento. I just knew that he went there. And so that piqued my interest. And so when we met, I go, oh my, I was so blessed that I was attracted to him and still am, thank God. And most of all, that he loved the Lord. And the rest is history. And so we'll be celebrating our 20-year anniversary June 28th, as a matter of fact. It hasn't always been easy. There's been ups and downs and ups, but the Lord has been faithful to us and blessed our marriage. And I, like you, I was a divorcee. My ex-husband, whom I was married to age 20 and 24, he was unfortunately mentally abusive, verbally abusive, and sometimes physically abusive. And so that's the reason why my prior marriage had dissolved. But anyway, I'm sorry for going down the rabbit hole a little bit about my story, but I just wanted to share, since you shared with your personal story about how you and Sharon met. So that's beautiful. So Derek, so tell us once again what your website is and how can people purchase your books and listen to your podcasts and everything about you.
Well, the best way to follow what we're doing is to go to gilberthouse.org, gilberthouse.org. That links to all of our websites. Sharon's got a personal site. I've got a personal site. My podcast has a site, but we link to all of that stuff from gilberthouse.org. And then when you're there, click the link in the top menu bar that takes you to our app, and then get the free app, because all of our content goes there. It's also got a Bible module, which is amazing. The developers of the app and many of our fellow travelers here in ministry, like Mike Heiser's Miklot, like L.A. Marzulli, like Dr. Doug Hamp, Dr. Ken Johnson, Pastor Casper McLeod, L.A. Marzulli, they all use this same company for the app. Skywatch TV, Prophecy Watchers, that it's the same company because we found that they're so reliable, and it is affordable for small ministries. And also they don't seem to want to cancel us. So we can say stuff that might get us in trouble on YouTube at some point. So get the app. But like I said, there are other things in there, and we've just started using a feature that's built into that app that might get back to something that Mike, you asked about earlier, building community. It's got a feature in there called messaging, which allows us to connect through the app and bypass Facebook, Twitter, MeWe, or any of the other sites. It goes directly through the app, and we can share back and forth. So we've got different like rooms or groups set up for our various programs, the Bible study, and one just devoted to prayer requests. And we're finding that it's still, small. We've got a few dozen people in there now that I don't know how many people have downloaded the app at this point, but it is a nice and tight, well, thank you. A nice, tight group of people who are beginning to share back and forth. And I think that may be one way that we can start connecting and not have to worry about triggering the algorithms that are trying to censor us on social media. So gilberthouse.org, get that app. iOS, Android, Amazon Kindle Fire works on all of those. We've also got a Roku channel for if you want to put it on the big screen. But again, for the mobile devices, the app would be the way to go. And you can follow all of our stuff there.
Awesome. Great. Yes. Get his app, get Derek Gilbert's app, that way that he's not reliant on YouTube and these other websites that could cancel him because of telling the truth. And we know that in these last days here, the internet is cracking down on truthers and people that are red-pilled and people that are sharing the truth like Derek and Sharon are. So yes, definitely get the app, folks. And thanks so much for listening or watching the Strange O'Clock podcast with Derek Gilbert and Michael, and have a strange and Holy Spirit-filled day. Bye, folks.